Hey guys, for our video today we're going to be taking a look at domain and range. For this video you're going to need two different colored highlighters. So the first thing that we need to know is what is domain. So domain is the set of all x values. When we're looking at a graph, we are going to be thinking about what two vertical lines can we draw so that we sandwich our graph in between. And then for range is the set of all y values. When we're looking at a graph, we're going to be looking at what two horizontal lines can we draw so that the graph is being sandwiched in between. So now that we know what domain and range are, we're going to look at how to find the domain and range when we're looking at a set of ordered pairs. So for this first example, we're given the ordered pair 2, -3, the ordered pair 4, 6, 3, -1, 6, 6, and 2, 3. If domain is the set of ordered pairs, I'm going to go through and I'm going to highlight all of my x values. For the domain, what I need to do is to do set, or the brackets, and I'm going to list all of my x values in order from least to greatest. Now, what's important is just because the number 2 appears twice, I only have to list it once. So that tells me that my x values in this example are 2, 3, 4, and 6. For range, I know that range is the set of all y values, so I'm going to go through, I'm going to identify my y values, I'm going to write them in order from least to greatest, and we're going to put them in brackets. So I know my range, or all of my y values, is -3, -1, 3, and 6. Now what I would like you to do is to pause the video and complete the second example for ordered pairs. So given this set, I would like you to identify the domain and the range. After you've done that, continue on with the video. So for the next part of this video, we're going to be looking at finding the domain and the range from a graph. What's going to be important here is in writing interval notation. If there's an open circle, that means that the value is not included, and we're going to use a parentheses in our interval notation. So open goes with parentheses. If it's a closed dot, that means that the value is included, and we're going to be using a bracket in our interval notation. So that's going to be very, very important in writing your answers. So looking at our first example, we're going to start with the domain. So over here to the side, I did a reminder for you that domain, we're sandwiching the graph in between two vertical lines. Range, we're going to sandwich the graph in between two horizontal lines. So if you take a look at my graph over here, I drew a line vertically through -7, and I drew a line vertically through +5. I want you to look at that for a second and determine why I would have drawn my lines through -7 and +5. So that's correct. We drew a line through -7 because that's where the graph stops on the left side. And I drew my line through +5 because that's where my graph stops on the right side. So when we go to write our domain, we're going to write down those two x values. So I know I need to write down -7, and I know I need to write down +5. What we have to think about is, do I use a bracket or do I use a parentheses? For the -7, it's a closed circle. When it's a closed circle, what do I use? A bracket or a parentheses? That's right. When it's a closed circle, we're going to use a bracket. So if I use a bracket for a closed circle, if it's an open circle, we're going to have a parentheses. So we should write our domain like this. We have a bracket, -7, (5) with a parentheses. So that's how we find the domain looking at a graph. For range, we're going to do the same thing, but instead of drawing our highlighter lines vertically, we're going to draw our highlighter lines horizontally. So I want you to do this with me. I'm going to go and I'm going to select a different color for my highlighter. Range, I know I'm going to have to look horizontally. So what I want to determine is where can I draw a line looking at the bottom of my graph where it stops. I notice that if I draw my line right here, that my graph stops there. So none of my graph is below my teal line. The same thing, I'm going to look at the top of my graph and I'm going to determine where can I draw a line. If I drew my line way up here, that's nowhere near my graph. So you want to make sure that it is touching your graph. So I'm going to come right here, and that's where it looks like my graph stops. So for the range, we're going to look at these two horizontal highlighter lines that we have, and we're going to determine what those y values are. So if I look at my bottom one, I notice it's at -1, -2, -3. And if I look at my top one, I notice it's at +1. So I want you to think about, for the -3, do I need a parentheses or a bracket? And for the +1, do I need a parentheses or a bracket? And I want you to go ahead and write the answer. So you should have gotten your answer to look like this. -3 has a bracket. We put a bracket because if I go back to the -3 as my y value, it's a closed circle. I know closed circles go with brackets. For my +1, it's an open circle, so that's going to be a parentheses. So we have determined the domain and the range of this function. So let's look at our second example. For our second example here, we are going to start with looking at the domain. Remember, domain is going to be vertical lines. So I'm going to go and I'm going to get my highlighter, and I'm going to look on the left and I'm going to say, okay, where does my graph stop? If I'm looking on the left, I notice that it stops right here. So I'm going to draw a vertical line through that point. Now, here's where the tricky part comes. I know that I need to draw another vertical line on the right where the graph stops. However, I see an arrow here. That arrow means that my graph keeps going. So there's nowhere I can draw a line where it's going to stop. So in that case, I'm just going to write an infinity symbol to remind myself that it's going to go from my yellow line all the way to infinity. So when we write our answer, we're going to start with the one on the left, so it starts at 0, and it's going to go all the way to infinity. I don't see an open circle here, so I know I'm going to need a bracket, so my answer is going to look like this. For range, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to be looking at horizontal lines. So I'm going to go and I'm going to select a different colored highlighter. I'm going to look at the bottom, and on the bottom I'm going to decide where does my graph start. I see that it starts here, so I'm going to draw a horizontal line. Now I need to look on the top. So it kind of looks like my graph stops here. However, this arrow means that my graph is going to keep going up and up and up and over. So really there's nowhere I can draw a line on the top where my graph is actually going to stop. So I'm going to put another infinity up here to remind me that it keeps going. So for our range, it starts at 0 and it's going to go all the way to infinity as well. So for this example, the domain and the range are exactly the same. So for our next example, we're going to look at the domain and the range of this function. So for domain, I'm going to go back to my yellow highlighter, and I'm going to look at where can I put my vertical lines that it sandwiches the graph. So if I look on this side, it kind of looks like my graph stops here. However, those arrows, if you remember, means that it's going to keep going. So there's actually nowhere where my graph is going to stop on the left. So on the left, I'm going to write negative infinity to remind me that my graph keeps going. On the right, there's nowhere that I can draw a line on the right where my graph's going to stop. So I'm going to put a positive infinity to remind myself that it stops there. So therefore our domain, since there was nowhere where we could actually draw lines, our domain is going to go from negative infinity up to positive infinity. For the range, we're going to go to a different colored highlighter. We're going to determine where our graph stops on the bottom. So on the bottom, I can see that my graph doesn't go below this point. So I'm going to draw my line through there. Then I'm going to look at the top and I'm going to see where does my graph actually stop. Just because it stops here on my coordinate plane doesn't mean that it doesn't keep going. So since it's going to keep going and it's going up to the positive numbers, I'm going to put an infinity to remind myself that it keeps going. So for the range, I know that it's going to start at 0 on the y values and it's going to keep going to infinity. The 0 is a closed circle, so I know that that means that I'm going to need a bracket. So we've taken a look at several examples of how to find the domain and the range. I encourage you to go back and to rewatch those examples and make sure that you understand how we got the domain and range for each one. When you feel like you've got it, this is the one that I want you to do to try. So for this graph, I want you to use your two different colored highlighters, draw your lines for domain, draw your lines for range, and record them record your answer in your notebook.